We're going to talk about cloud today. It's kind of an important topic in government. The new administration has requested something on the order of about $9 billion for provision services in cloud next year across the federal space. That's quite a bit of money. That's almost 10% of all of what's allocated for IT across the entire government. So it's a huge topic. There's a lot of important things going on there. And I think we should start just on the security aspect. There's always been a myth since 2006, since I was in college, since cloud came out, that cloud wasn't very secure. Maybe we shouldn't do it in the government. We've seen a lot of moves to the contrary, right? We've seen the intelligence community go to the cloud. We've seen increased activity in the Defense Department, and especially recently in moving to the cloud. There's a new directive from Secretary Mattis to push DoD further into the cloud, if you will, and a lot of interesting use cases across the government, and we have some folks to talk about that. But first, let's address that security myth, and I think no better person than Matt to start us there, since he's been with FedRAMP for what, 4 or 5 years now? 4 years?
From the beginning. I actually wrote the policy memo. So, yeah, I think security. I started the federal government on the Federal Cloud Computing Initiative in 2009. And our mission for that was, it was under the CIO Council, and it was basically to remove the barriers to adoption. We had a few that we were focusing on, and I took on security and then sort of created FedRAMP out of that. And I fundamentally thought that security in the cloud was just a sort of thing that people were saying so they didn't have to move to the cloud. You've heard a lot of people refer to things like server huggers, or people who think that if they see their server, can touch their server, get warmth from it on a cold winter day like today, that they can actually think it's secure, which is inherently not necessarily true. And one of the sister orgs that was at GSA when we started was the Federal Federal Data Center Consolidation Initiative. And if you've ever followed that through the years, we started out thinking there was like 1,200 data centers. Then the second round of data requests went to like 4,000 data centers, then like 6,000 data centers. And so in my mind, I figured cloud providers were more secure than what we had in the federal government, because at least cloud providers knew where their assets were because they're charging us for their use of it. So if they know where it is, and know what they have, then likely it's inherently more secure than when we don't even know where everything is. And so what's been really fascinating with FedRAMP is creating this sort of common baseline. What we heard from all of our providers was basically, when we were launching it, was make a consistent security standard and apply it. We'll do whatever you need us to do, government, but just don't make us redo it every single time we get a new customer. And so what we've done is really held a sort of solid line with FedRAMP around what the security requirements are and what you have to meet. And there's some flexibility depending on the type of cloud or certain risks that are there. But for the most part, there's a really solid line of security that I think if you compare it to IG reports across the government around systems, you're going to see that cloud security is a lot better than a lot of the systems we have out in government. And that's not me picking any specific agency. Every agency has certain systems they're using that are legacy systems, and things that can't be updated, things that can't be upgraded, that are inherently less secure than what the new technologies are that are out there. And so that's something I've been really proud to say with FedRAMP, is that we've kept a sort of security bar that when people come, they can expect something from a cloud that says it has FedRAMP behind it, so they know that security isn't the biggest concern in moving. It's functionality and how I'm going to use it and migrate my existing services, rather than saying security is the impediment to me getting to it.
You guys have been flexible enough too to offer a high baseline, right? So if you're more, if you have more sensitive data, if you need more security, you can actually request that and get authorized through the high baseline instead, right? So.
Exactly. Brett from Amazon. Amazon's one of our providers who has a high baseline or meets the high requirements for their government cloud. We have, I think, 3 providers right now: Amazon, Microsoft, and CSRA. And so we've definitely have that sort of flexibility. We have high baselines. We have a moderate baseline, which is about 80% of federal systems, and a vast majority of systems that are probably appropriate to move to the cloud, or the moderate baseline. And we also have a latest release this last year for low impact sort of software as a service, like really low risk services too. So we've tried to sort of keep up with use cases around making those baselines match what agencies need.
Mike, how about you guys at DHS? Tell us about what you're doing there.
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, I think we need to start with the understanding that it's really easy to do crappy security on any infrastructure, right? And so when people talk about, well, I think Matt said it best. When people raise security concerns with the cloud, it was usually as an excuse to avoid going to the cloud. It's also hard to do really good security on any infrastructure in many cases. So it takes a lot of investment in resources and focus and a lot of discipline. I do think, however, so I don't really think infrastructure is the dominant factor in how secure you're going to be. I think that's the bottom line. I do think modern cloud technologies probably have an inherent advantage on a number of dimensions. Matt alluded to several of them, right, in terms of their focus and understanding on their infrastructure. But also, when you start really looking at pushing the envelope on infrastructure as code and automation of deployments, transparency and visibility across everything that you're doing, you are going to start radically improving your security posture. And I think the adoption of cloud technologies actually helps in that regard. The other thing I think fundamentally has to start occurring, cloud is an accelerant to that. People have to start changing the way they think about security models. And the traditional perimeter-based security model, the cloud already forces some of that conversation just by its very nature, right? It extends the data center, or in some cases it's completely outside of your traditional boundary. And so understanding the fact that the traditional perimeter security model is not really working well for us anymore, and we have to start moving to a model where we don't trust things just because they're inside some particular boundary. We have to have strong authentication, strong access control, and strong encryption of data across the entire application lifecycle.
Right. So good cloud's not easy. It's like anything else, right? Like a relationship, it takes a little work. Exactly. So, Christine, you guys, and I'm not speaking from experience, but Christine, you guys have a long journey, right, at the FCC in the cloud. And I remember your predecessor, Dr. Bray. I sat down with him a few times talking about how he was trying to go 100% to the cloud by 2017, but we're not quite there yet.
Not quite.
Talk about the challenges you guys have faced along the way.
Is that why he left?
Left where?
Because he wasn't quite done. He wanted to get out before the. Oh, okay.
Oh no. So I think the best part about being FCC over the last 3 years is the fact that we've actually had an opportunity to actually start and simply move to the cloud. So everybody's always asking us, how did you do it? Where did you start? For us, it's always been just start. Simple application, something that doesn't rely heavily on perhaps integrations across other platforms or application and legacy applications. You can start with something that's really small internal that will help automate something for your internal user base, or something that's external but doesn't solely depend on a specific other applications or entities. And so we were able to do that. Obviously, David's talked big about the Consumer Help Center, and we have done a lot of just even smaller applications since then, like our network outage reporting system that's widely used right now due to all of the hurricanes and things happening there, and obviously the emergency system that we have. So when you see the nice little lettering across your TV that says we're conducting an emergency alert, that's what, we track all that. So, and we were able to move smoothly from actually a legacy application or system to the cloud. So Frank asked me to talk about challenges, right? So I think one thing that we need to remind ourselves is that it doesn't happen overnight, right? So I think a lot of people think it's going to happen overnight, but there's a lot of specific components related to that. So namely, obviously, acquisition. So how do you get to the service that you want in order to move to the cloud? You need the workforce, the human capital. So you need folks who are actually going to be able to have that mindset to be able to implement on the cloud, regardless if it's a platform or an ICE service. And then I would say, we've talked a lot about security, and I think the biggest thing is that it used to be really at the forefront of like how we're going to secure, but we are relying heavily on our cloud providers to do a lot of that security. It's a different mindset now about the security piece, whereas before you're worried about getting to the latest patch level, getting out of old technologies and legacy technologies. Matt talked about that, to really now saying our governance model is making sure that you get to the latest level, the latest version from the service platform, and they force you to do that. Because the service platforms and the cloud providers move at a fast pace. So some of them move with major version upgrades twice a year, 3 times a year. Some of them do minor, but it forces you to upgrade. Whereas the mentality before is like, well, we just don't have time, we're focused on the mission. This actually helps you do both at the same time. So challenges, it doesn't happen overnight. Procurement is one thing, right? So we haven't really, I think in the federal space, gotten procurement right for cloud services just yet. But I do know that GSA and other agencies are working really hard to make sure that they offer the right type of services for us to just easily be able to procure cloud services, which is great. We always think about data, right? So the underlining thought process and mentality is, what about my data? What's going to happen to my data, right? What's the challenges around the data? And obviously, for every organization, data is important. Many organizations are data rich. So how are we securing that data? How are we encrypting it? How are we using it, right? So those are a couple challenges that people go through still to this day. And I think...
I was going to interject, just there's a couple ways you can go off that. So one thing I thought was interesting was the people quotient of that, right? So not only did it seemed like there was an entire team around built and cultivated at FCC to deal with this migration and David used to say we're change agents, right? So to get shit done, like that's what he used to say in the hashtag, right? So to get stuff done and work around that migration effort. And then the second is the effect on existing people too. So you have an existing workforce, contracting folks, you have government employees that jobs will change when you do this kind of thing. And in your case, I think it was hundreds of contracted folks, and I don't have it written down, but I feel like some of them had been there an average of like 15 years. So very entrenched, if you will.
Yes, absolutely. And you're right. So Frank, I think the biggest thing is if you're going to change the way an organization thinks, you got to bring in people from the outside. What we've done really well over the last 3 years, and we continue to do now, is partner government and industry together to actually move that forward. So what David did 3 years ago is he brought in those change agents, folks from industry who have a mindset to be able to move fast, be agile, be flexible, be able to communicate with the business owner, understand their requirements, and move at an agile pace to be able to implement something. And so that was a success with Consumer Help Center and a few other applications. The other thing to that point is now we're 3 years in, right? And so I'm just recently taking over as acting CIO with David's departure, and I'm continuing that trend of ensuring that we're continuing to move to the cloud. And actually, over the last 3 years, people have bought into that, and so they are eager to actually make a change and make a difference and be able to produce and deliver to that new roadmap.
I think one thing I'd add to that too, though, is the two things not to underestimate of how that's worked well for you all is, one, a leader or leaders who firmly believe and continue to push the vision, but also giving like something like a moniker, like change agent. Like it gives something people like a rallying cry of like, not only am I following the leader's vision, but also now I'm like part of a cool group that I get to call myself something. Like things like that actually do and get the human element of people involved and engaged and like bought into something. And I think that's really important. That technology is not the problem in getting this done. It's really people and figuring out how to have leaders that promote that, as well as getting people to buy into that vision in ways that might seem silly at times, but really gets people engaged and sort of bought in.
So to that point, right, so now we have people eager to come and work at FCC because we're on the bleeding edge, right? So whereas before, and Frank said, right, we had a lot of legacy people, and with every contract, there's a recompete and there's change. We have people now who are eager to be part of this new mission because they want to be bleeding edge and they want to be moving us forward to, right now cloud computing is huge and we're debunking cloud, but what's next, right? People are talking 20 million other things, right?
Yeah, so it's not just the shiny object, right? You got to have some people, right? Technology is technology, and there's how many vendors have gone through some kind of FedRAMP authorization at this point, Matt?
We have about 95, and then we have about another 80 that are working towards something.
Right, so there's a lot of options that you have. People still matter just as much as anything. Also, you guys have some really good happy hours at the FCC, and I've been to many. So that's a great way to attract a workforce. I will say I've met people that have gotten hired after going there.
Yeah.
No, just a thought. So in terms of buying, that is a challenge, right? You guys have the same problem, Christine, and as a lot of agencies do, in figuring out how to pay for provision services, right? Because you're buying something, you may use X amount of something, you may not. You may have, in your case, you guys have like a comment system where there can be a demand that is driven up at a time for a week or two that's an extreme demand, and then months where you don't have anything, right, or you have very little. And the IRS is the same way. Tax season, you can imagine people get scared. They start thinking about doing their taxes. They use the IRS sites. Right? It's got to scale up. It's got to be able to do that, to meet demand. What are some of the ways that you guys are trying to pay for this stuff? And Matt, maybe we'll start with you, just because you probably have a government-wide approach. There's a lot of ways you can buy cloud. There's blanket vehicles. There's specific agency contracts. What are the ways you see work, and what ways are harder than others?
I mean, I think the biggest one, we can't expect the government to buy just like industry. In general, I mean, there are laws and rules in the way we get money and the way we spend money, and ways that we can't act like industry. And so I think for us to go in thinking that we can buy it just like industry is, one, a part of the problem, because we never will be able to. The industry doesn't have the laws and regs and rules that we do, and that's not it's not inherently the government agency's problem. We need to address it, but it's not something we're ever going to be able to overcome unless Congress changes laws. But I do think it also is something that we continue to say that it's a major problem, which somewhat detracts from the ability of agencies like FCC saying that, have they not contracted right to do it? People are doing it very well. DHS has some great contracts too that y'all are doing. GSA has some great ones. I think the biggest issue is making sure that the program owners who have the money and are contracting are doing it correctly and understand actually what it is they're asking for. Usually what I see agencies that go in and want a capability, but don't actually understand what they're getting from their CIO shop currently, so that they don't understand their spikes in demand or peaks in use and like all of that to actually budget out the appropriate amount to buy it, and don't understand that. And so then you also have acquisition officers who have 40 different things they're doing and don't actually functionally understand what the needs are of that customer and that within the agency. I use customer because that's a term I really like to use. But so I think for me, I don't think it's inherently broken. I think we have to know what our obstacles are, which a lot of people do, and then more closely align our acquisition offices with the people who are spending the money in the IT shop to make sure that they actually understand the requirements completely. Because if you do, then you can figure out. It's not like we don't do utilities across the government already. It's not like, I mean, cloud computing is utility computing is another way to phrase it. Well, we buy utilities, and we've been doing that for years. So there's an ability to do it. It is hard, but it's getting those people, the right people, to actually talk together.
That's a great point. I remember it was kind of my introduction to the federal government almost in many ways, and the challenges that we face. When I was talking to somebody about how we were going to procure some cloud services and the pay-as-you-go, kind of pay for what you use model, and they were like, no, we can't do it that way. And I'm like, well, what do you mean you can't do it that way? But that's the way that's one of the primary benefits of consuming a service like this, particularly when you look at folks who are looking at cost savings. The only model that really yields true cost savings is one where you have significant peaks and valleys, where you have to scale up and scale down. And you don't know in advance necessarily what those peaks and valleys are. So if you can't leverage that in the cost model and the consumption model, then you're in trouble. And it was eye-opening for folks like me who didn't quite understand what the government has to contend with, that there are real challenges. But, and this is a big but, there are scenarios that are in law and are kind of by statute, but there are far more obstacles that are self-inflicted, that are interpretations of law and statute, that are set in policy, that are the function of contracting officers who've been there for 20 or 30 years doing it this way for this kind of model, not actually, as you said, Matt, understanding it, and actually all the stakeholders coming together, putting in the effort to understand how to do it properly to drive the best mission outcome. And we have started seeing that change. We've seen folks come together and start doing things that make sense. But at the end of the day, people are the biggest challenge, like with all technology and change initiatives. And as we start addressing that over time, I think everything gets better.
I mean, I think, like, for me, most agencies default to firm fixed price. takes the risk off of the agency and puts it on the contractor. Makes sense. Why would you not do that? Well, cloud, that doesn't make sense. But then to get a non-firm fixed price contract, I have to justify why I'm doing a T&M or labor hours contract. So there is this extra burden, but it's one of those where the contracting officers need to make sure that they're aware that it's not that I'm trying to get around this, it's much more that I'm trying to actually get the best deal for government. And so I think that's where it's that true understanding between the contracting officer who's trying to make sure things are done correctly, because they have their own liability behind it, but just making sure they really understand from a technical perspective. And I think that's a large part of, I think, the IT shops and CIO shops' responsibility to, if they can't appropriately describe what the needs are to a contracting officer, it's never going to go well. And to be able to simply describe that to a non-technical person is difficult, but I think that's one of the biggest things that sort of will help acquisitions in the future.
So one thing I would just add is I would love to see more CEOs who are technical and have technical backgrounds, right? Because while I think two things, right? I think IT people tried their very best to be precise on what we want, but sometimes we need somebody to validate and cross-check us, and those really are the CEOs, right? So, I mean, they're looking at it from a business and from a contracting perspective. It would be very helpful for us to see more people who got that technical skill set from a CEO shop to be able to work with in partnership, to be able to go out with right contracting vehicles for cloud services.
I would like to see more of our IT workforce with technical backgrounds, quite frankly.
That's not for me.
That's actually a really good point. So there was some research that came out we wrote about earlier this last week, where it's like 4 times. We were talking about this too earlier, Mike. 4 times as many IT workers in the workforce are retirement age or older. So four of those for every one that is under the age of 30 in the federal government.
And this is, I mean, it's mind-boggling. I actually was talking to Frank because I saw that article on NextGov. I posted it, and everybody on my LinkedIn, was talking about it. But it actually,
it's not fake news.
It's not fake news. I don't think so. No one accused me of fake news, so it was good. It was a good day. But literally, my head started to explode in small chunks because that's a real problem. I mean, we spent a lot of time at DHS talking about how we build the next generation digital talent, right? And that's kind of how we phrase it. It sounds like a snazzy thing, right? Next generation digital talent. But I didn't, and I feel like I understood the magnitude of the problem, but when I saw that statistic, I recognized I was underestimating the scope of the problem. And, for all of our sakes, right, this is the federal government we're talking about. Whatever you think about the federal government or its various services, it performs many, many, many very important functions for our society and our country. And it almost all these days depends on information technology, critically so. And so that stat is very troubling, and we struggle to attract and retain the best and the brightest. And it tangentially, or more than tangentially, relates to things like how we start adopting cloud and other modern technologies, because without the people, as we just said, you can't do it.
I was going to say, just not to belabor that point, but how do you guys address that age issue if you see it at all? I mean, I know what you guys do. You just have a bunch of happy hours and smart people come, and then you're like, hey, you want a job? And then they're like, yeah, I'll do it. I'll try my career at public service. But no, it's not just like that. But for real, you guys do some cool stuff. The government's been doing job fairs, right? Hiring on the spot. I think they did one a few weeks ago. They hired hundreds of people the day of. And then we were talking, DHS did something like that agency-wide last year. Hired a lot of people and they were doing resume checks on the spot, right? So how do you mitigate that? How do you get these new people in that know stuff?
I mean, for us, we have to sell the mission, right? We have to sell the mission. We have to do unique events like that. But a lot of it starts also with culture change, right? One of the big obstacles we have is the culture of the federal government is not attractive to many younger workers. I mean, that's just a fact. And while I'm all for many of the elements that make the federal government what it is, like professionalism. There's a lot of folks in the military. We have real need for chain of command in operational units that are dealing with national security and other very important issues. But generally, the culture of the federal government needs to be more friendly to those younger workers to attract them.
Yeah, and just to add, so I mean, the millennials are here, and the next generation after the millennials is coming, and those folks are not going to want to sit in an office. They're not going to be stuck behind a cubicle, right? They're going to be able to work from wherever they are at whatever hour they want. And so what does that look like for the next generation for us? I mean, even at the FCC. So I mean, those are cultural items, right? So people are used to be able to touch you, feel you. Sorry, wrong word. Have you close, right? I mean, and be able to walk to your office, right? So that's just not the way the millennials work these days, and that's not going to be something.
What kind of managers did you have growing up, man?
No,
those happy hours must be really good.
Those happy hours are good. Glad I was a little funny today. I'm glad I was a little funny today. But so, you know, those are the things that we're looking at. And so as we move, even the FCC is moving headquarters space from where we are now, we're looking at what does that new office space look like, because it's not going to be the same that we have now. It's just not. So it is culture. It is about bringing new blood in, being able to get new ideas, and being able to continue to just break barriers. I mean, we need to like continue to move forward, and I think that's something that we're encouraging at the FCC. I think even before David came, that was not something that was really truly encouraged. But just today, I had a conversation with the lead of one of our contractor staff, and I simply said, I want consultants here. I want people who are at the bottom, who are actually dealing with all the problems every day, to come forward and say, we can make this better, and this is how I think we can make this better.
I was going to say, what you're talking about reminds me of NGA, so National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. They're one of the 17 IC agencies, right? They're the sister of the CIA and the NSA. They're actually opening an office in Silicon Valley, and they're going to staff it with like 100, 150 people. They're going to share office space with GSA in their 18F. I can't remember the address there. It's like 40 Worldview.
Don't say it.
Something like that.
It's whatever the World Trade Center.
Yeah. Anyway, so they're doing that. They're hiring 3 different teams, and they're trying to bring in people from Silicon Valley. They're emphasizing young people with skill sets that they don't have a lot of at the NJ, to sort of build up their analyst shops and to hire in data scientists. They recently hired a chief data scientist across the NGA, and they're even considering pilots right now of teleworking in the intelligence community, which is crazy. I mean, like, if you would have said that 10 or 15 years ago, like after 9/11, people would have looked at you and been like, nah, it's not going to happen. But they're actually piloting that kind of stuff because of that need, like because they know they have to get this kind of young people. But anyway, not to belabor that too much, we have some time for questions. I have a few more questions myself, but I'd love you guys to give these folks some questions, and we have a microphone somewhere. So if anyone wants to start us off and be daring. We got a question here in the middle, in the front. You get the Bold Star Award today.
Oh, excellent. Well, I thought this
was
another
free
excellent
drink
panel, so this was easy to be first. First of all, you all were great. Thank you so much for the information. One, have you thought about FedRAMP University? I work for the federal government, and every other person is a FedRAMP expert, and they know nothing about FedRAMP. So,
and they'll all say that they've had a meeting with me and that they know me personally.
So
yeah.
I'm slightly confused about how we get to the true subject matter expert, but I think providing a platform where people can come and sort of get educated on the portfolio of things that you mentioned here today, putting together something like that, whether it's with industry and GSA and FedRAMP, whomever. I just want to be the pioneer of FedRAMP University. I want to be the first one to champion that.
You claim Angela Washington invented FedRAMP University.
Yes, and so then I did have another question. You mentioned that there are sort of levels to this cloud services through FedRAMP. So AWS and Microsoft, and another is the high, and then there are about 90 that have gone through the application process. Are those large companies, medium-sized companies, small companies? And I asked that question based on we work obviously with trying to incorporate a lot of smaller vendors into the government procuring process. Well, it's sometimes challenging for the smaller vendors to understand how they will work in this new sort of environment. And I know you did some great things like FedRAMP Tailored. Those things were wonderful. Could you talk a little bit more about who's in that size-wise portfolio and how you address it?
Sure. So one, just at the FedRAMP University, that is something that's one of our sort of initiatives over the next year to 2 years, is really bringing out more training. We're focusing a little bit more on the vendor side right now, but then also figuring out a way to do something with agency employees. I do think honestly, though, part of that's a little more NIST driven, because they are sort of the owners of that. We're simply sort of enforcing or putting into practice those requirements. So it's something I think would be that we need to work with them more on, like how they can turn that into a program, or someone could sort of then bless someone doing that. In terms of the vendors, so the different size, the high, moderate, and low, they're all either moderate or high. So there's roughly 90 at moderate and 3 at high. Those are basically related to the data impact levels. So high being systems that if that data were to be breached, it could potentially be the entire degradation of an entire organization, cause loss of life or limb for a person, or financial ruin or catastrophic financial ruin, I forget what the exact term is. And then moderate's basically almost all the data you would think of that's not public, that doesn't reach up to that level or higher. So like almost every normal system you'd be on would be that for most civilian agencies. And we look at the size of the vendors. We have all of the major players are there that we know of, or at least are actively working. And then about a third of our providers are small business. So of those that are authorized, I think it's like 30%, and of those that are working towards an authorization, it's about 40%, which was surprising to me when we were doing our analysis of it too, because it is a big barrier to get into the government is to do these security authorizations. But I think one of the benefits that we bring from FedRAMP is that previously it was you would do it at State Department and spend $200,000. You would then go to Interior and spend $100,000. Then you go to Energy and spend another $150,000. And this way you're doing it once. The initial barrier is always going to be there. That's not something that we can totally help remove, and I don't think we should, because we have a different standard across government we need to meet for security. But what we can reduce is that continued cost with that, and trying to make clear expectations going into it, because I think also before we were there, it was very unclear what a security authorization took. Sure, NIST had some documents out there, but there was no sort of, this is what it's going to take, this is the amount of documentation you have to do. And so I think that was something that we've tried to really do. Like we just had an agency authorization playbook come out for agencies to know how to do it as well. So I think that's something that we've tried to do, is make sure that those small businesses, it is actually a viable path to get them through, and they see that they can get a big ROI on that through the program.
So you should call Matt Goodrich, 1-800, right here, this man right here. You should just call him directly, and he will help you.
He'll be the Dumbledore of FedRAMP University when it opens.
Yeah, Mike, if there's going to be a Hogwarts, if FedRAMP Hogwarts, I would definitely be there.
Yeah. Mike, you're one of the few agencies in government that would actually probably make use of each and every one of those levels. Plus, you also have the potential option, if on the high side, of tapping into the C2S as well, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is, we actually suffer probably from a syndrome where many of our law enforcement agencies and other of our mission partners, components, excuse me, I would say overestimate the sensitivity of the data. Everybody wants to be in high because it's easy to go to high. It's harder to make the argument, to go to mod, and then if something happens, the question is, why did you go there? So we have a lot of our particular law enforcement agencies that put everything at high, and there's some conversation around that. Again, we do have lots of sensitive data, but the bottom line is there's a cost associated with that, right? Now that we have the high cloud environments, it's less of an issue than it was before, because it used to be an argument not to go to the cloud, and that was a real problem for us. But now that we can get there, and we have C2S and other high side environments, the bottom line is if the business owner and the mission owner wants to, and the CISO and all the information security professionals need to classify the system that way, then go for it. And we're going to take advantage of all that. We do think the FedRAMP program is a tremendous boon to the adoption of the cloud, and we're very happy it exists.
Other questions? We got about 2 or 3 minutes left. Is there anyone else that has one? Oh, yeah, all right. 2, Sophia and Christina.
Hi, my name is Sophia. I recently was mission assigned to FEMA in response to the hurricanes, and we were trying to operationalize crowdsourcing. And one of the challenges that happened was we had all these digital volunteers that wanted to help. They were using things like Google spreadsheets and cloud services, but we couldn't, through the FEMA firewalls, well, we found ways to hack around that, but essentially, right, no, you did not hear that, but basically try to at least meet where these digital volunteers were. And I also, at USGS, we use Google Enterprise, but we can't share outside of the Department of Interior, so we all sort of ask for forgiveness. But, you know, to be able to collaborate and coordinate in this day and age is really critical. So I don't know if you guys have found any challenges or opportunities around that issue of using cloud services.
First of all, thank you for volunteering to help FEMA. We've had a little bit of a rough go of it there. But listen, it's a huge problem. You know, the ability to collaborate with the public in a secure way, right, in an unpredictable way is a real challenge. I think some of the stuff actually that GSA is doing with login.gov to try to create trustworthy public identities to help provide access to common access and authentication to government systems will, if we can get there, will be very, very beneficial to do that. But when you want to try to take advantage of commercial systems, you know, that are out there that make life very easy, you know, outside of the federal government, it's really hard and frustrating sometimes to do that. But we have to remember, you know, look, FEMA, you know, often finds itself in those situations, and but we have to remember those safeguards are there for a reason, because, you know, bad actors can get into those systems and use those systems as entree to other systems, and, you know, we do have to be careful, but we have to find a way to strike that balance. That's a good question. Good point.
I think there's also, I mean, I've seen some conversations over the last year with OMB and others around, particularly around things like IM and communications, around pushing our industry partners to really change the way that you can connect, because we use Gmail at GSA. Well, I can't IM someone on O365. And so people are finding other ways to communicate, and I think in my mind, that's actually much more, that's something that the vendors need to address and that we need to push from the government side. So I've seen a lot of conversations starting with that, and I think there is a finally sort of a recognition from industry of how truly problematic it is, because we've been able to detail some of the stories like FEMA and others where we're trying to connect with this person and this person and this person, and we can't do it, or people are using Facebook for messaging, which is ridiculous, right? But that's like the only thing they can do when they're out in the field and there's a fire behind them. You know, but so I think that's something that I have seen at least a lot of conversations start. I don't know how far it's going, but I will say it's something that I think there's a recognition of.
Christine over here.
Thanks. I apologize in advance that this is going to be a complicated governance question. So in the last 7 years, I've literally attended hundreds of events, starting with the Cloud First initiative. And I started asking questions around the management of the content, because garbage in, garbage out. And I think we've gotten to the point, and I'm so thrilled about FedRAMP at least having a baseline from a governance perspective about the way the information is going to be managed. But we still don't have a reconciliation between the requirements from a records perspective, and we can't get into the details between data, records, information, and knowledge. But it's important because you have these pressures within agencies to meet the requirements for NARA, but they don't necessarily meet up with other business requirements of managing the data from an analytics perspective to gauge new knowledge and insights into things that are going on. So I'm wondering, where in the federal government is the leadership coming from to morph from the old model, NARA, paper records, the idea that you needed to document and keep for the long term, and in some instances for the life of the republic, certain information, and to facilitate the ability for FOIA officers to meet their FOIA requirements to get to the information that's being requested, and then for the records officers, in many instances in agency statutory positions, to manage that information to ascension to NARA. So I think there's been this disconnect between we want to use these new technologies and manage information, and you know, the other issue is how to do the analytics when it's at rest and it's encrypted, et cetera. So I'm just wondering, where do you see that coming from?
I'll do one thing just so y'all don't have to get in trouble with your own agencies and do something super specific. I would say the ability to do that in the cloud is 10 times better than what systems agencies have now. And so in my mind, it's really just bad contracting. So, I mean, in our requirements for FedRAMP, you have to be able to have litigation holds on the system. So the ability of the cloud providers to do that's there. Also, I think, you know, Brett was talking earlier when he was introing this about vendor lock-in being not as big of a problem in the cloud as it is with current systems. You know, doing a e-FOIA or a litigation discovery, something with that on a cloud system is vastly different than doing it on a legacy system. And so it's really much more on the owner or the person who's doing the contract to make sure they contract appropriately to have that, but the ability to get that data and save that data and move from one vendor to another vendor is vastly easier in a cloud environment than it is with the current legacy environments. I mean, if it was easy to do that from our legacy environments, then we'd have way more in the cloud already. Because people would have moved from those legacy systems to the cloud, they would have moved that data already. So I think that's something I would just say is we already have the requirements from a security perspective. You can just think of it in a different way, and then it's really how people are enforcing it.
Yeah, and I would say, I don't quote me on this, but I think DHS has something like half of all the federal government's like FOIA requests, right? We have a lot of them.
Some of mine from like 2 years ago, bro. I make them all the time.
I'm not in that department. The bottom line is, Matt's 100% right. I think it's more than 10 times better, right? I think it's several orders of magnitude better if you have it electronically stored. We do look at policies around electronic retention of data the same way we do around paper retention. So that's definitely a part of what folks do. But what we do have to actually look at our FOIA systems and our other archival systems like we do any other system, and they need to be modernized. They need to be modernized to take advantage of newer technologies that we're talking about here. And right now they're not, so we haven't fully realized the 10x or 100x benefit that is there.
All right. Is there one last question? If there is, I'll go. They told me not to, but I'm kind of a rebel. Wait, one last question right over here. Sorry, Annie.
Shut out.
Giving Annie her workout today.
Thank you. So I'm a government employee, and what happened with our OPM data a couple years ago? We all remember?
Oh, boy.
So if we had been in the cloud, would that been avoided or not?
Well, I think you can't answer that question, right? The bottom line is being in the cloud doesn't strictly avoid any security breach, right? That breach was caused by lateral movement inside an organization that came through a vendor. That could have happened in any infrastructure, like I said earlier. The infrastructure doesn't by default make you more secure. If you have somebody in your system, they can migrate into another system. If that system happens to be in the cloud, you could still be compromised. I think what we said is there are advantages in being in cloud infrastructure that can help you drive better security posture. But if you simply taken the OPM system and lifted and shifted it, you guys remember that term, lift and shift? We all said how bad that was. If you lift and shift the OPM system and put it in the cloud, and it was still connected to that vendor system in the same way, the breach would have rolled out in the exact same way.
No. So Mike just mentioned lift and shift. I just want to say we were successful at the FCC with lift and shift, but thank you so much.
I'm not gonna disagree. I'm not gonna fully agree. I mean, something that we do in FedRAMP is we look at lateral movement within providers and going from one tenant to another, and making sure that authentication and things like that. So if it had been a FedRAMP cloud, might have been different. But I think that's something that we definitely take a big look at, and looking at how the providers are built. If they, to your point, if you lifted and shifted that environment over, then no, because that's the one environment. But that is something that we look at within FedRAMP systems. Multi-factor authentication, you can't get in without it. That prevents 80% of breaches. We also make sure that all of our penetration testing of our environments look at tenant-to-tenant attack vectors that isn't done for a lot of on-prem systems because they don't think of that as different tenants. So it is something that we look at from protections, but to the point, no, it wouldn't have changed anything if they lifted and shifted, but I think the way that the clouds are built could prevent similar types of systems if they were being built in those environments.
I think what I would say is that their environment would not have passed the FedRAMP high controls, right? In other words,
they didn't have a modern.
Exactly. I agree with you 100% that if you have the right controls on a cloud environment, that's a different story. The same way, if you had the right controls on an on-prem environment, you probably wouldn't have had that breach either.
All right, cool. If you guys want to stick around, have a drink or two before we have to get out of here, feel free. But thanks for coming. Thanks to you guys for giving us your time today, and thanks to AWS for hosting this thing. Y'all have a good day.
Thank you.